Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of some books that I've recently unhauled, as well as a couple of books that I've recently DNF'd. And when I go about this, my goal is not to convince you not to read books. I'm not going to be ranting and telling you, oh my gosh, these books were awful. It's more just letting you know what didn't work for me. And also maybe in talking about that, some of you might actually find these books sound really interesting and you might end up wanting to check them out. So I'm actually going to start with the two DNFs. I have talked about these both recently. They would be the First Binding and Notorious Sorcerer. So the First Binding, it is really similar to Name of the Wind. I already am not a huge fan of Name of the Wind, that style of telling the story where you are having a character telling you their life story. It's hit or miss for me already. And on top of that, as I began reading this one, I could see so many parallels very quickly to Name of the Wind. It was also quite melodramatic, and sometimes that works for me, and other times gets to a point where I don't feel particularly captivated by what's happening. I feel like sometimes because it's a character telling their life story, it almost feels like they're trying to play up their life and they're trying to play everything into your emotions, but so much so that I'm like, I just don't really feel like you feel like a real person. Because of that style of telling a story, you have this unreliable narrator who's trying to make you feel a certain way about them, and I can respect the way that you can dissect that kind of a story and really analyze like what's real and what's not, and how you can try to get pieces of the world through that, but it was just not my preference. And on top of that, it is very similar, really similar to Name of the Wind, and I already didn't love Name of the Wind, so it just wasn't going to be one that worked for me. I did see one of you leave a really funny comment though, because I said I could see this being something fans of Name of the Wind would like because it's so similar, but at the same time I could see some people being frustrated because it's so similar and they might feel like it's too similar. But one of you said you don't mind because maybe at least this one will be finished. So there's always that. Notorious Sorcerer is one that I read about a third of it, and the premise and the first chunk of it was so interesting, but it was one of those stories that once it started to get moving, I didn't feel like I really was keeping the same pace as the story. At the very beginning in the opening, we are discovering that there is alchemy in this particular fantasy world. And alchemy is not necessarily legal, but there are definitely people who still use alchemy, and typically it is people of high society. Our main character is somebody who really wants to learn more about alchemy, but they do not have the means. So they are trying to become what is basically an errand boy for some of these elite individuals in their society who do have some pretty obvious connections with alchemy. It's just because they're high society. From what I gathered from the parts that I read, it seems like they can kind of get away with it because they have the wealth, because they have the prestige, because they're the right kinds of people in their society. There's a lot of history and details about previous wars and things like that that play a role in that. So all of the world building details I was finding really interesting. Anyway, our character is somebody who is an errand boy for these individuals, hoping that eventually, one, they can earn enough money that they can get involved in this high society, but on top of that, they are kind of aligning themselves with people who already have alchemical powers. The alchemy has to do with different planes of existence in a sense, so the other plane is not like you see an alternate version of yourself. It's not necessarily like that. It's like you go into basically another world. It's almost a portal fantasy. But the planes, it would seem, are slightly out of alignment, and so strange things are starting to happen. Our main character is also discovering more about their magical capabilities. All this was so cool, so cool. And I was really enjoying the concept of the story. I didn't dislike the writing style. The characters definitely felt like they were standing out on their own, and the world building details were really cool. But it was a lot, and it was a lot quite fast. So I think that for a lot of people, that's not going to be an issue whatsoever. For me, when I have a story that has that much to it, I kind of actually like when it's a little slower. And something like Storm My Archive, where for a lot of people, they get bored at the beginning. They're like, I don't know what's going on. And oh my gosh, this book is huge. And also, when is something going to happen? And for me, I actually like that everything is happening slow for a while because it allows me to feel like I understand the world. And then every time I come to the story, I feel like I'm transported to it. And with this one, it kind of almost felt like a movie that somebody turned on, and then it felt as if I came in to the middle of a movie, or I left and then came back, and then we'd already gone ahead a bunch, and I felt like I was missing some things. So again, it's not going to be one that I think a lot of you will feel exactly the same as me. I think a lot of you are going to think it's really, really cool. So definitely give it a go if it sounds interesting. Now switching into the Unhaul books. First up, we have For the Wolf and For the Throne. This is a fantasy duology that is sort of a hybrid in the first book of Little Red Riding Hood and Beauty and the Beast, but much darker, much more atmospheric, and with a haunted forest setting. And so I actually quite liked the first book. I thought the blend of fantasy and romance was actually a really good mix. We actually basically follow a different character in the second one, and it almost reminded me of a Greek gods type of story. It almost felt like we're going into the underworld. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to reveal plot points and spoilers. I would say that the main character in the first one, their story is basically over by the end of book one. And then you're getting this other character, you're following them. And so this is like their story. But I guess it wasn't distinct enough where it could stand by itself, because now there is, I would say, a lot of fantasy romance stories, or just romance stories also, where you'll get a series, but they're all kind of a series of standalones. And so you don't have to read them in order. They all kind of feel distinct. A good example is the Regency fairy tale stories. So Half a Soul, Long Shadow, and 10,000 Stitches. You don't technically have to read those in order, and they can stand on their own, but you get those extra details if you read them in order. And this almost felt like it was that, except for not quite. You couldn't read the second one without the first, but then it made it so that the second one, I wish that those characters had been a bigger deal in the first. It was kind of a strange mix of things for me. So I liked the writing. I liked the atmosphere. I liked the first one a decent amount, but as a duology, it just didn't quite work for me. And I do think, though, that whatever the author puts out next, I'm definitely interested in, because I didn't dislike these books. I didn't hate them or anything like that. They just weren't ones that I really felt like I would likely reread. The next one, I actually really liked this book, and that would be This Vicious Grace. I had pre-ordered this, and I did not realize I was going to be getting a copy of it in the Fairy Loot box that I have. So I got a Fairy Loot edition, and I like the Fairy Loot edition a lot more than the US edition. So I took the US edition in. That's it. Next up is a very popular book, but it was just okay for me, and that would be House in the Cerulean Sea. I didn't care really for Under the Whispering Door either. And I thought with Under the Whispering Door that a lot of it was the themes of death and what happens after you die. And I was thinking a lot of it was that I just don't care for those themes and stories. And there are times where it works for me, and Under the Whispering Door just wasn't one of those times. But maybe it's the writing style, because House in the Cerulean Sea, to me, a lot of the same beats were hit as in Under the Whispering Door. And I think there's something about the main characters in both. Obviously, the main character, if you've read both, the main character in Under the Whispering Door, the idea is that he's a terrible person, and he's really callous and doesn't care about people at all, basically. And then he dies, and he's really resistant to dying. He just doesn't feel like it's fair. And then he's learning how to have empathy, basically, in death. And so he's definitely an unlikable character who grows throughout the story. The character in House in the Cerulean Sea is somebody who's just kind of going through the motions of life, and they're almost apathetic. They just don't really have a lot that really excites them and makes them happy, or they don't really have a ton of personality. And then they go to this place, they're a social worker, and they meet these unwanted children at this orphanage, and these children are really sweet, and they're just misunderstood, and the person who's currently caring for these children is very charismatic and charming and eccentric and interesting. And for me, the MC was just a little too fill in the blank. It was one of those characters where I just feel like they didn't have a ton of personality. And the rest of the characters have plenty of personality. But I just found that you could make them feel anything, and it wouldn't really feel like character growth, because I didn't really feel like they started with a whole lot of, I don't know, I just didn't like the main character very much in the story. And the love interest was so charming and nice and sweet, and there was a little part of me that was sad, because I wanted to really like the romance, but it felt in both Under the Whispering Door and House in the Cerulean Sea, both times it very much felt like this wonderful, lovely, super empathetic, just adorable human being was having to like teach this other person how to be more caring. And I don't know what it was. I just don't really... I want it to be kind of equally matched, you know? I get why the main characters in both books liked the love interest, because I'm like, yeah, both times they're really sweet. But I don't really know. You just... Obviously in House... Or Under the Whispering Door, that character's just super unlikable. So I'm like, I mean... Really? But in this one, it was just like, you're just a whatever person. I don't know. That sounds so mean. I wanted to like them more. And then I really liked the themes and the messaging of the story. I just didn't really find it as cute, I think, as a lot of other people. And I almost felt like it was, this is how I described it to my husband. You know, okay, maybe some of you will be like, that's exactly what it's like. And I love that book, and that's a perfect way to describe it. And maybe some of you will think this is a little harsh. I don't know. So you know those self-serve frozen yogurt places where you get your flavor, and then you go to the front, and you're like, hey, I would like a little bit of that and a little bit of that. You know, for me, it's like graham cracker crumbs and maybe a little bit of something with peanut butter mixed into something that's not too flavorful yet, you know, and like, that's good. The things complement each other. And then you watch like an 8-year-old go through the self-serve and they get, you know, whatever flavors of ice cream, and they go and get like gummy bears and M&Ms and like whatever colorful candy they can think of, whatever thing they like, and it's just so much sugar. And, you know, in both instances, it's a lot of sugar. In both instances, it's a lot of sweet. But one of them is a lot, right? You know what I mean? That was sort of House of the Cerulean Sea for me. It was a lot of candy, but not necessarily kinds that mix well for me personally. I'm sorry for this terrible metaphor. Moving on. This next one, there's not much to say about it. I, once again, got this in a book box. It would be the Stardust Thief. The book box edition, beautiful. Without its sleeve, gorgeous. I had a Book of the Month edition, and I like my special edition more, so I took the Book of the Month edition in. That's it, though, for some books that I've recently DNF'd or unhauled. With the DNFs, hopefully those sound interesting and you actually found something that you are now going to check out. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.